November 12, 1943. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Commander Takeo Nakamura's hands trembled as he spread the latest intelligence reports across the mahogany table. The numbers refused to make sense. 6 months ago, Japanese naval intelligence had estimated the Americans possessed 50 operational submarines in the Pacific. The new reconnaissance data, compiled from merchant ship sightings, radio intercepts, and agent reports, told a different story. 173 confirmed American submarine contacts in the last 90 days alone. Either their entire intelligence apparatus had catastrophically failed, or the United States had achieved something unprecedented in naval history. They had built an underwater armada in less time than it took Japan to construct a single capital ship. Nakamura had fought to dismiss the reports as exaggerations, the panicked observations of merchant captains seeing threats in every shadow. But the evidence was undeniable. American submarines were everywhere, operating with a coordination and frequency that suggested numbers far beyond anything Japanese planners had conceived possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The intelligence failure had begun 3 years earlier, rooted in assumptions that would prove catastrophic. In 1940, when Japanese war planners assessed American naval capacity, they operated from a framework shaped by their own limitations. Japan's most advanced submarine construction facilities could produce approximately 8 submarines annually. German intelligence, shared through the Axis alliance, suggested American shipyards were less efficient than Japanese ones, hampered by union labor, divided production, and democratic bureaucracy. Japanese planners confidently estimated that the United States could produce perhaps 12 submarines per year, 15 at absolute maximum, with wartime mobilization. The calculations seemed generous, even conservative. It accounted for America's larger industrial base while recognizing the inherent complexity of submarine construction. These were not simple cargo vessels. Each submarine required precision engineering, specialized steel alloys, complex electrical systems, and torpedo tubes machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Such sophisticated vessels, Japanese experts agreed, could not be mass-produced like automobiles. The very suggestion was technically absurd. Vice Admiral Terahisa Komatsu, Chief of Naval Intelligence in 1941, had personally authored the assessment that guided Japanese strategy. American submarine construction facilities in 1940, he wrote, consisted of 4 primary yards: Electric Boat Company in Connecticut, Portsmouth, Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, Mare Island in California, and Cramp Shipbuilding in Philadelphia. Combined maximum capacity, 20 submarines annually under optimal wartime conditions. The assessment was filed, approved, and became the foundation for all subsequent planning. Based on these calculations, Japanese strategists concluded that American submarine forces would never pose a serious strategic threat. Even if the United States mobilized immediately after Pearl Harbor, they would have perhaps 70 submarines operational by 1943, maybe 90 by 1944. These numbers were manageable. Japanese merchant marine planning allocated anti-submarine resources accordingly. Convoy escorts were designed for a threat level that assumed fewer than 100 enemy submarines across the entire Pacific theater. The first hints of catastrophic miscalculation came in February 1942. The American submarine, USS Trout, evacuated Philippine gold reserves and delivered critical supplies to Corregidor, demonstrating operational range that surprised Japanese observers. In March, USS Gudgeon sank the Japanese submarine I-173, proving American boats were combat effective. By April, submarine attacks on Japanese shipping were occurring with disturbing frequency. Still, Japanese naval intelligence maintained confidence. Early American submarine effectiveness was attributed to tactical surprise and Japanese focus on offensive operations. The numbers remained within acceptable parameters. 30 to 40 American submarines operating in the Pacific seemed consistent with pre-war estimates. Summer 1942 brought the first serious anomaly. Intelligence reports logged 63 separate submarine contacts between June and August. Analysis suggested at least 45 distinct American submarines were operating simultaneously. This exceeded projections, but wasn't yet alarming. Perhaps the Americans had accelerated construction, or maybe pre-war inventories had been larger than estimated. Commander Nakamura, then a junior intelligence analyst, had drafted a memo suggesting a revised estimate of American submarine strength, 60 operational boats with production capacity of 18 per year. His superiors accepted the revision without concern, but the attacks intensified. In September 1942, Japanese merchant losses to submarine action exceeded 5 ships weekly. In October, the number climbed to 7. By November, 10 Japanese cargo vessels were being torpedoed every week. The mathematics was troubling. If 45 submarines were operational and each conducted patrols lasting 60 days, with 30 days for refit, then approximately 30 submarines should be at sea simultaneously. 10 kills weekly suggested each submarine was sinking a ship every 21 days, a success rate that seemed impossibly high, even accounting for American torpedo improvements. 2 explanations presented themselves. Either American submarines were far more effective than Japanese, anti-submarine warfare had anticipated, or there were significantly more submarines than intelligence had estimated. Commander Nakamura began investigating both possibilities. What he discovered would challenge everything Japanese naval planning had assumed about American industrial capacity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Japanese agent in Panama, monitoring ship traffic through the canal, had been cataloging submarine movements since Pearl Harbor. In January 1943, he transmitted a report that naval intelligence initially dismissed as error. Between January 1st and December 31st, 1942, he had observed 87 distinct American submarines transit the Panama Canal from Atlantic to Pacific. Not 87 transits, but 87 different boats, identified by hull numbers painted on their conning towers. The report seemed impossible. 87 submarines implied total American strength far beyond any estimate. Intelligence officers suggested the agent had miscounted, seeing the same submarines multiple times, or misidentifying hull numbers in difficult viewing conditions. Commander Nakamura thought otherwise. He cross-referenced the Panama observations with submarine contacts logged by Japanese merchant captains. The hull numbers matched. American submarines operating off Japan's coast bore the same identifiers the Panama agent had recorded 6 months earlier. Nakamura presented his findings to Vice Admiral Komatsu in February 1943. The analysis suggested American submarine strength was at least 100 vessels, possibly more. Production capacity was clearly far beyond the estimated 20 boats annually. Komatsu reviewed the data with increasing discomfort. If the assessment was accurate, every strategic calculation regarding Japan's merchant marine security was fundamentally flawed. The admiral authorized expanded intelligence gathering. Every merchant ship captain was ordered to record and report submarine sightings with hull numbers when visible. Radio intercepts were analyzed for patterns suggesting submarine density. Reconnaissance aircraft were tasked with photographing American naval facilities. March through July 1943 produced a cascade of disturbing revelations. Merchant ship reports logged 214 submarine contacts with 136 distinct hull numbers confirmed. Radio intercepts suggested American submarines were operating in wolf packs, multiple boats coordinating attacks like German U-boats in the Atlantic. Even more troubling, the submarine attacks were occurring simultaneously across vast distances. Boats struck in the Sea of Japan, while others hunted in the South Pacific, and still more, prowled the Central Pacific shipping lanes. The geographic distribution of attacks provided the most damning evidence. For 100 submarines to achieve such widespread coverage would require exceptional deployment efficiency. But Japanese calculations suggested the attack patterns indicated at least 150 submarines, possibly 200. Commander Nakamura spent sleepless nights reviewing data, searching for errors, hoping to find miscounts or duplications. The numbers only grew larger. By August 1943, he estimated American submarine strength at 175 operational boats. His superiors resisted the conclusion. Vice Admiral Komatsu demanded verification through alternative intelligence sources. Naval attachés in neutral nations were tasked with gathering information about American shipbuilding. The results confirmed Nakamura's worst fears. American submarine production had not just exceeded estimates, it had shattered them. Intelligence from Switzerland, gathered through financial analysis of American steel allocation, suggested submarine production of 40 boats annually. Reports from Sweden, analyzing American electricity consumption patterns at known naval facilities, indicated even higher numbers. The truth emerged piece by piece through autumn 1943. The United States had not merely built submarines faster than Japan anticipated. They had revolutionized submarine construction itself. American shipyards had applied mass production techniques developed in automotive manufacturing to submarine building. Components were standardized across multiple classes. Welding replaced riveting, cutting construction time by 40%. Prefabrication allowed sections to be built simultaneously and assembled rapidly. Electric Boat Company alone was producing one submarine every 17 days, but Electric Boat was only one facility. American submarine production had expanded to 10 major construction sites by 1943. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, Mare Island, Manitowoc Shipbuilding in Wisconsin, Cramp Shipbuilding, Boston Naval Shipyard, and 4 additional facilities were all building submarines simultaneously. The production rate was staggering. 42 submarines commissioned in 1942, 53 in 1943. Production was accelerating, not declining. Commander Nakamura's November report laid out the catastrophic intelligence failure in stark detail. American submarine strength as of November 1st, 1943, 195 operational boats. Projected strength by December 1944, 250 submarines. By war's end, possibly 300. The Americans had built an underwater fleet larger than Japan's entire submarine force in just 2 years. They had accomplished what Japanese experts had declared technically impossible. The implications cascaded through every level of Japanese strategic planning. The merchant marine, designed to operate with minimal convoy protection, was completely vulnerable. Anti-submarine vessels, allocated based on estimates of 50 enemy submarines, were outnumbered 4-1. Shipping routes, planned assuming manageable submarine threat levels, were actually death traps. Japan's entire resource supply strategy, dependent on shipping from conquered territories, was being systematically destroyed by an enemy force 4 times larger than anyone had imagined possible. Vice Admiral Komatsu read Nakamura's report in silence. The admiral had built his career on intelligence accuracy, on understanding enemy capabilities and intentions. This failure was not a minor miscalculation. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity. The implications extended beyond submarines. If American shipyards could produce submarines at 5 times the estimated rate, what about destroyers, carriers, battleships? What about aircraft, tanks, artillery? The admiral called an emergency conference. For November the 15th, senior naval staff, intelligence chiefs, and economic analysts gathered to assess the damage. Commander Nakamura presented his findings with clinical precision. The Americans had not achieved superior submarine production through better engineering or more skilled workers. They had done it through industrial organization on a scale Japan had never attempted. Their shipyards operated like factories, each submarine rolling off production lines with the regularity of consumer goods. The conference room fell silent as Nakamura displayed production charts. Japanese submarine construction, 8 boats annually, each taking 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. American submarine construction, 42 boats in 1942, 53 in 1943, projected 65 in 1944. Construction time, 14 months in 1942, reduced to 8 months by 1943, targeting 6 months by 1944. The Americans were building submarines faster than Japan could build cargo ships. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, asked the question everyone was thinking. How had intelligence missed this? How had the entire naval command failed to recognize American industrial capacity? Nakamura had prepared for this moment. He displayed the original 1940 assessment, showing the chain of assumptions that had led to catastrophic underestimation. Japanese planners had judged American capacity by Japanese standards, assuming cultural and political limitations would constrain industrial output. The assumptions seemed reasonable in 1940. Democratic societies, with their competing interests and labor disputes, could not achieve the unified mobilization possible under authoritarian control. American workers, softened by consumer culture and high living standards, would not endure the sacrifices necessary for maximum production. American corporations, motivated by profit rather than national purpose, would prioritize commercial interests over military needs. Every assumption had proven completely wrong. American democracy had mobilized faster and more completely than Japanese militarism. American workers, far from being soft, were producing war materials at rates Japanese laborers could never match. American corporations, operating on profit incentives, had proven more efficient than the state-controlled Japanese industry. The entire framework of Japanese strategic thinking had been based on fundamental misunderstandings of how democratic capitalism functioned under wartime pressure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Commander Nakamura continued his presentation with growing urgency. The submarine miscalculation was not an isolated error. It revealed systemic failures in how Japan assessed American power. Intelligence had underestimated aircraft production by similar margins. Estimates of American bomber construction in 1942 had suggested 2,000 aircraft. Actual production exceeded 18,000. Fighter production estimates had been off by factors of 3 to 5. Tank production, artillery production, naval vessel production, all had been catastrophically underestimated. The pattern was consistent across every category of military production. Japanese intelligence had observed American peacetime industrial capacity and projected modest wartime increases. What actually occurred was industrial transformation. American factories that had produced automobiles now built tanks and aircraft at rates that defied Japanese comprehension. Steel mills that had supplied construction now fed military production at volumes that exceeded total Japanese output. The Americans had not simply mobilized their existing industry, they had created entirely new industrial capacity specifically for war production. The conference room remained silent as the full magnitude of the intelligence failure settled over Japan's naval leadership. But understanding the mistake was not the same as correcting it. By November 1943, the damage was irreversible. American submarines were already strangling Japan's supply lines, and the underwater fleet was still growing. Commander Nakamura's next set of statistics revealed just how devastating the miscalculation had become. Between December 7th, 1941, and November 1st, 1943, American submarines had sunk 612 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling over 2 million tons of shipping. The rate was accelerating. October 1943 alone saw 93 ships torpedoed, the highest monthly total of the war. Japanese merchant marine planning had allocated escort vessels based on the assumption of 50 enemy submarines. With nearly 200 American boats actually prowling the Pacific, Japanese convoys were catastrophically underprotected. A typical convoy might have 2 destroyer escorts defending against what planners assumed would be 1 or 2 submarine contacts during the voyage. In reality, these convoys were passing through zones where 10 to 15 American submarines were operating simultaneously. The Japanese escorts, designed for a threat level 1/4 of actual submarine density, were simply overwhelmed. Captains reported situations where they would detect 1 submarine, maneuver to attack, and discover 2 more had positioned themselves for torpedo shots during the defensive action. The submarines themselves represented technological achievements that compounded Japan's intelligence failures. American fleet submarines of the Gato and Balao classes possessed capabilities Japanese planners had not anticipated. They could dive to depths of 400 feet, beyond the effective range of most Japanese depth charges set for 250 feet. Their diesel engines provided surface speeds of 20 knots, faster than many Japanese escort vessels. They carried 24 torpedoes, 3 times the load of Japanese submarines. Most critically, they had operational ranges exceeding 11,000 miles, allowing them to patrol for 70 days without refueling. These capabilities enabled operational patterns that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine was not designed to counter. American submarines could wait submerged for hours, tracking convoys by sound, then surface at night to attack at high speed before diving again. They could operate in coordinated groups, sharing reconnaissance and overwhelming escorts with simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. They could patrol the sea lanes between Japan and its conquered territories indefinitely, creating zones of permanent threat that forced merchant captains to choose between slow, circuitous routes that consumed precious fuel or direct routes that led through submarine-infested waters. Captain Mochitsura Hashimoto, commanding the cargo vessel Tama Maru on the Singapore to Yokohama route, kept a diary that documented the psychological impact of the submarine campaign. Every voyage became an exercise in sustained terror. His November 1943 entry recorded the journey's grim mathematics: 1,800 nautical miles through waters where submarine contacts were reported daily, zigzag patterns to complicate torpedo solutions, reducing speed and increasing fuel consumption by 30%. Constant sonar watches that detected shadows and thermal layers as potential threats, sleep deprivation among crews who knew that torpedoes could strike at any moment, day or night, without warning. The submarines were rewriting the rules of naval warfare in ways Japanese doctrine could not counter. Traditional naval power had been measured in battleships and carriers, massive vessels whose guns and aircraft dominated battle spaces hundreds of miles in radius. But those capital ships required fuel oil, ammunition, and supplies delivered by merchant vessels. American submarines were destroying the merchant fleet faster than Japan could replace it, and every ship sunk weakened the entire naval structure. A single submarine costing $5 million and crewed by 80 men could sink a tanker carrying fuel for an entire carrier task force. The economic and strategic mathematics favored submarines by margins that made traditional naval competition irrelevant. The statistics told a story of systematic strangulation. Japan had started the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By November 1943, over 2 million tons had been destroyed, primarily by submarine action. Replacement construction managed only 800,000 tons. The merchant fleet was shrinking at a rate of 60,000 tons monthly. Japanese war planners had calculated that maintaining the empire's economy required at least 4 million tons of operational shipping. They were already below that threshold, and the submarines were multiplying. Lieutenant Commander Tatsunoke Ariazumi, an intelligence officer specializing in economic warfare, presented projections that turned the conference into an exercise in confronting inevitable defeat. At current loss rates, Japan's merchant fleet would be reduced to 3 million tons by mid-1944, 2.5 million by early 1945. But those projections assumed submarine numbers remained static at 200 boats. Commander Nakamura's intelligence suggested American submarine strength would reach 250 by December 1944, 300 by mid-1945. Loss rates would increase proportionally. Japan's merchant fleet would effectively cease to exist as a functional economic force by autumn 1945. The implications cascaded through every aspect of Japan's war economy. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, essential for naval and air operations, required tankers that were priority targets for American submarines. In October 1943, 4 of 7 tankers dispatched from Borneo to Japan were sunk en route. The survivors delivered less fuel than a single tanker carried, after accounting for the circuitous routing required to avoid submarine concentrations. At current loss rates, oil imports would fall below minimum requirements by spring 1944. The combined fleet would be immobilized not by battle damage, but by fuel starvation. Food imports faced similar mathematics. Japan's home islands produced only 60% of the rice required to feed the population. The remainder came from Korea, Taiwan, and Indochina, transported by merchant vessels, increasingly unwilling to brave submarine-infested waters. In November 1943, civilian rice rations were reduced to 300 grams daily, barely sufficient for subsistence. The rations would decrease further as shipping losses mounted. The specter of mass starvation loomed over strategic planning like an executioner's shadow. Industrial raw materials presented equally grim scenarios. Steel production required iron ore from China and Malaya, coal from Manchuria, all transported by the shrinking merchant fleet. Aluminum production needed bauxite from the Dutch East Indies. Rubber, tin, tungsten, every strategic material that fueled Japan's war machine depended on shipping lanes the Americans were systematically closing. The submarines were not merely sinking ships. They were severing the arteries that connected Japan's industrial centers to the resource zones the empire had conquered at such cost. Vice Admiral Komatsu asked the question that would haunt Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the war: could anything be done? Commander Nakamura's response was clinically honest. Anti-submarine warfare could be improved, escort numbers could be increased, convoy tactics could be refined, but these measures would reduce losses, not eliminate them. The fundamental problem was mathematical. Japan faced 200 submarines with escort forces designed for 50. Building sufficient escorts to achieve parity would require diverting shipyard capacity from merchant vessel construction, accelerating the fleet's decline. Building more merchant vessels required abandoning escort construction, leaving convoys even more vulnerable. Either choice led to the same destination: systemic economic collapse. The conference reviewed options with increasing desperation. Could Japan build submarines to counter American naval logistics? Japanese submarines, designed for fleet operations against warships, lacked the range and endurance for effective commerce raiding against American supply lines. Converting them would take years Japan did not have. Could mines close the sea lanes, forcing American submarines into defensive operations? American mine-sweeping capability exceeded Japanese mine-laying capacity. Could air patrols suppress submarine operations. American submarines spent most patrol time submerged, surfacing only at night when aircraft were ineffective. Every countermeasure encountered the same obstacle. American industrial capacity had created a force structure Japan could not match with available resources. The human dimension of the submarine campaign emerged in reports that filtered through the bureaucratic language of casualty statistics. Merchant marine deaths exceeded combat losses in any other branch of Japanese military service. Of approximately 122,000 Japanese merchant sailors serving during the war, 60,000 would die, a 50% casualty rate that exceeded even kamikaze pilot losses. These men died in waters burning with oil, clinging to wreckage as sharks circled, trapped in sinking ships as compartments flooded. They died, knowing their deaths served no strategic purpose, that the cargoes they carried would never reach Japan, that their sacrifice could not change the mathematical certainty of defeat. Survivor accounts painted pictures of horror that statistics could not capture. Seaman Hiroshi Watanabe, rescued after his cargo ship was torpedoed off Truk in December 1943, described watching the vessel break in half and sink in 90 seconds. 83 crew members entered the water. 12 survived the initial sinking. 3 lived long enough to be rescued 48 hours later. His account noted details that revealed the psychological impact of the submarine campaign. The American submarine that torpedoed them had surfaced briefly, not to attack survivors, but to photograph the sinking and verify the kill. The submarine's hull number was visible, USS Harder. The crew members appeared young, well-fed, confident. They took their photographs and submerged, leaving survivors to their fate without malice or mercy. Professional sailors conducting efficient warfare. The submarine campaign's effectiveness derived not from cruelty, but from systematic application of industrial warfare principles. American submarine captains operated under clear rules of engagement. They attacked merchant vessels carrying military supplies or strategic materials. They generally avoided hospital ships and adhered to international law regarding neutral vessels. But within those parameters, they prosecuted the campaign with relentless efficiency. The best captains achieved kill rates that surpassed the performance of German U-boat aces. Commander Dudley Walker Morton in USS Wahoo sank 19 ships, totaling over 55,000 tons in 5 patrols. Commander Richard O'Kane in USS Tang accounted for 31 ships before his own vessel was sunk. Commander Samuel Dealey in USS Harder destroyed 16 Japanese vessels, including 5 destroyers, demonstrating that submarines could hunt warships as effectively as merchants. These successes reflected training and doctrine that Japanese intelligence had failed to anticipate. American submarine schools produced crews trained to standards Japanese submariners rarely achieved. They practiced attacking in simulators that replicated combat conditions. They drilled on damage control until every sailor could manage flooding, electrical failures, and mechanical breakdowns instinctively. They studied Japanese merchant routing, analyzed convoy formations, and shared intelligence through systems that gave every submarine access to comprehensive target data. The American submarine force operated as an integrated system, each boat contributing to collective intelligence that improved everyone's effectiveness. Japanese responses revealed the limitations of playing catch-up against an opponent who had already achieved industrial and operational superiority. Anti-submarine warfare improvements came too late and in insufficient quantities. Escort carriers, designed to provide convoy air cover, began appearing in mid-1944 when submarine losses had already crippled the merchant marine. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft entered service as American submarines developed tactics for avoiding air patrols. Improved depth charges with deeper settings arrived after American submarines had learned to dive below effective engagement ranges. Each countermeasure addressed yesterday's threat, while American submarines evolved new tactics faster than Japan could respond. The intelligence failure that had underestimated American submarine numbers reflected deeper misunderstandings about how democracies wage total war. Japanese military planning, shaped by cultural assumptions about hierarchy and sacrifice, could not comprehend how American society mobilized resources. The United States did not rely on exhortations to patriotic duty or coercive labor conscription. Instead, they offered wages that made war work attractive, implemented production techniques that multiplied individual worker output, and created organizational systems that coordinated millions of workers across thousands of facilities without requiring authoritarian control. The submarine construction program exemplified this approach. Electric Boat Company did not receive orders to build submarines regardless of cost or worker welfare. Instead, the Navy negotiated contracts that guaranteed profit margins, incentivizing efficient production. The company responded by revolutionizing construction methods. They designed submarines with modular components that could be manufactured by suppliers nationwide, assembled at shipyards by workers who specialized in specific tasks rather than mastering entire vessels. They implemented three-shift operations that kept construction bays active 24 hours daily. They recruited women and older workers to replace men conscripted for combat, training them on simplified tasks that reduced the skill requirements without compromising quality. The results demonstrated industrial warfare's true nature. Victory belonged not to the most dedicated soldiers or the most sophisticated weapons, but to the society that could produce overwhelming material superiority. Japan's submarine designers had created vessels technically superior to early American models. Japanese submarine captains displayed courage and skill equal to their American counterparts. But Japanese industry could not build submarines fast enough to affect strategic outcomes. American industry could, and the numerical advantage proved decisive. By spring 1944, the submarine campaign had achieved strategic effects beyond the ships destroyed. Japanese merchant captains, facing 50% odds of surviving their next voyage, began refusing assignments. The merchant marine, already hemorrhaging experienced sailors to casualties, lost additional personnel to desertions and psychological breakdowns. Ships sat idle in ports because crews could not be assembled. Cargoes accumulated in warehouses across the conquered territories, while Japan's factories shut down for lack of raw sea materials. The empire was collapsing from internal resource starvation, while its armies still held vast territories and its navy retained substantial combat power. The irony was not lost on thoughtful Japanese officers. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but beyond that, he had no confidence in victory. His prophecy proved accurate not because American carrier task forces defeated the combined fleet, though they did, but because American submarines severed the economic connections that made Japan's empire viable. The territories conquered at such cost in blood and treasure became liabilities, requiring garrisons that consumed supplies that could not be delivered, producing resources that could not be transported home. Commander Nakamura spent the final months of the war documenting the intelligence failure's full dimensions. His reports, compiled into assessments that would never influence strategic decisions because the decisions no longer mattered, revealed the catastrophic cascade of errors. Initial underestimation of American submarine numbers had led to inadequate escort allocation. Inadequate escorts led to increased losses. Increased losses forced circuitous routing that reduced cargo delivery efficiency. Reduced efficiency increased the number of voyages required to transport equivalent cargo. More voyages meant more exposure to submarine attack. The cycle fed on itself until the merchant marine effectively ceased functioning as a strategic asset. By August 1945, when atomic weapons ended the war, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to less than 1 million tons of operational shipping, 83% destroyed from the 1941 total. American submarines accounted for over 50% of that destruction. The underwater fleet that Japanese intelligence had estimated at 50 boats had grown to 247 submarines by war's end. They had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. They had also destroyed 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. The submarine force, comprising less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel, had destroyed 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. The human cost transcended statistics. 60,000 Japanese merchant sailors died, along with uncounted passengers, soldiers being transported to island garrisons, civilians evacuating threatened territories. 3,500 American submariners perished, a 22% casualty rate that made submarine duty the most dangerous service in the U.S. military. 52 American submarines were lost, taking their crews to depths from which no rescue was possible. These men died knowing they were winning, that each patrol degraded Japanese capacity further, that their sacrifice contributed to victory. Japanese merchant sailors died knowing they were losing, that survival was increasingly unlikely, that their deaths would not change the outcome. The intelligence failure that had underestimated American submarine strength by 400% revealed truths about modern warfare that would shape naval strategy for generations. Industrial capacity, not battlefield courage, determined victory in total war. Intelligence services that judged enemy capabilities by their own limitations would always underestimate opponents who approached problems differently. Democratic societies, when fully mobilized, could outproduce authoritarian states because voluntary cooperation achieved efficiencies that coercion could not match. These lessons, learned at such terrible cost, would influence strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. For Japan, the submarine campaign represented defeat's clearest proof. The empire had conquered resource-rich territories across Asia and the Pacific, only to watch those resources become inaccessible as American submarines closed the sea lanes. Japanese factories had the technical capability to produce sophisticated weapons, but lacked raw materials because submarines sank the ships carrying them. The combined fleet possessed powerful warships that could not sortie because submarines had sunk the tankers carrying fuel. The entire strategic edifice collapsed, not from weakness at the top, but from systematic destruction at the foundation. Every merchant vessel torpedoed another brick, removed from the structure supporting Japanese military power. Commander Nakamura survived the war, living until 1987. In later years, he would reflect on the intelligence failure with the clarity that only hindsight and peace can provide. The miscalculation, he wrote in his memoirs, stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of American character. Japanese planners had seen American democracy's debates, its labor disputes, its regional differences, and concluded these represented weakness. They had not understood that open society's arguments were the process by which America identified optimal solutions, that competition between corporations drove innovation, that workers who could quit jobs demanding better wages were more productive than conscripts who could not. The very features Japan's militarists identified as American weaknesses were actually sources of strength that authoritarian systems could not replicate. The 247 American submarines that had strangled Japan's empire represented more than industrial achievement. They embodied a different approach to warfare, one that emphasized systematic application of overwhelming resources rather than spectacular decisive battles. Japanese naval doctrine, shaped by Mahanian theories about climactic fleet engagements, had prepared for Trafalgar in the Pacific. America fought a different war, using submarines to methodically destroy Japan's merchant fleet, while surface forces advanced across the Pacific, each supporting the other in a coordinated campaign that gave Japan no single critical battle to win or lose, only the slow, inexorable pressure of superior resources systematically applied. The men who served in those submarines, both American crews and Japanese merchant sailors who faced them, fought with equal courage in a campaign neither side could fully comprehend while it was happening. American submariners believed they were targeting military logistics, which they were. Japanese merchant sailors knew they were defending their nation's supply lines, which they were. Neither side fully grasped that they were participants in warfare's transformation, the shift from battle-centric to system-centric conflict, where victory belonged to whoever could sustain industrial production longest. The submarines were not just weapons, they were manifestations of America's industrial civilization, each boat a mobile expression of the factories, shipyards, and training systems that produced them faster than Japan could destroy them. The story of Japan's intelligence failure regarding American submarine numbers remains one of World War II's most profound lessons. It demonstrates how strategic planning based on flawed assumptions leads to catastrophic consequences, how industrial capacity matters more than tactical excellence, and how thoroughly modern warfare's totality punishes nations that misunderstand their opponents. The submarines that appeared where Japan expected dozens became the instruments of empire's destruction, not through spectacular victories, but through systematic, patient application of superior resources. They serve as eternal reminder that in total war, the nation that can produce overwhelms the nation that can merely fight, and intelligence failures about production capacity become strategic disasters from which no amount of courage or tactical skill can recover. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.